What if the map of North America changed overnight? What if one of Canada's most resource-rich provinces voted to leave? Not just to become independent, but to join the United States as the 51st state. It sounds impossible, but the idea exists. It's been debated, and under the right political pressure, it would trigger one of the largest constitutional and geopolitical crises in modern history. How would Alberta legally separate from Canada? Would Washington even say yes? And if it happened, would it bring prosperity or chaos? Tonight, we break down the law, the politics, the economics, and the real human impact of a scenario that could redefine two nations. Because sometimes the most unlikely ideas reveal the deepest cracks beneath the surface. Please like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment the next video topic in the comments. Imagine waking up one morning and turning on the news. The headline reads, Alberta votes to separate from Canada. Stock markets freeze. World leaders hold emergency calls. Oil prices spike. Social media explodes. And suddenly, something that once sounded like political fantasy feels real. But here's the truth. Political earthquakes don't begin on voting day. They begin quietly. They begin with frustration, with conversations at kitchen tables, with radio talk shows, with long winters and long memories. To understand how Alberta becoming the 51st state is even discussed, even hypothetically, we have to go back decades. Because this story doesn't start with the United States. It starts with identity. Alberta is not just another Canadian province. It is vast, snow-covered peaks in the west, endless prairies stretching east, oil sands beneath the soil, ranching towns, energy cities, blue-collar pride. For much of modern Canadian history, Alberta has been the economic engine of the nation's energy sector. When oil booms, Alberta booms. Downtown Calgary fills with cranes. New subdivisions stretch outward. Restaurants are packed. Paychecks grow. And when oil crashes, the silence is heavy. Offices empty. Homes sit unsold. Families worry. That cycle, boom and bust, shapes Alberta's political psychology. Because when you live in a place that rises and falls with global markets, you develop a different relationship with government. You become sensitive to policy, sensitive to regulation, sensitive to decisions made far away. And far away is exactly how many Albertans describe Ottawa. Ottawa sits thousands of kilometers east, politically dominated by Ontario and Quebec, culturally different, economically diversified in ways Alberta is not. Over time, a feeling grew in parts of Alberta that federal decisions were shaped by Eastern priorities, not Western realities. This feeling became known as Western alienation. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow burn. In the 1980s, energy policy disputes created tension. In the 1990s, constitutional debates revived regional divides. In the 2000s and 2010s, environmental policy sharpened disagreements again. Pipeline approvals stalled. Carbon pricing debates intensified. Climate commitments became politically charged. For many in Alberta's energy sector, these policies felt personal. They felt like constraints placed on the province's primary industry. Now pause here, because this is important. Whether those policies were justified or necessary is a separate debate. The key is perception. Perception drives political movements more than spreadsheets ever will. And the perception among some Albertans was this. We generate wealth. We pay into the system. And decisions are made elsewhere that limit us. That sentence, whether fully accurate or not, carries emotional weight. And emotion fuels political imagination. During economic downturns, the frustration grows louder. Radio hosts talk about autonomy. Comment sections fill with anger. Small advocacy groups begin organizing. Some push for greater provincial powers. Some push for reforming equalization payments. And a few, a small but vocal minority, push for independence. At first, it sounds dramatic. Secession? In Canada? But then history whispers something uncomfortable. Quebec already tried. Twice. And in 1995, the margin was razor thin. That vote shook the country. It forced Canada to confront a possibility that once seemed unthinkable. After that near miss, the federal government passed the Clarity Act. Its purpose was simple: make separation harder. A clear question, a clear majority, negotiated terms, no unilateral exit. But laws don't erase sentiment. They just shape how it must express itself. Now here's where the story shifts. Because independence movements often ask a follow-up question. If we leave, what then? An independent Alberta would be landlocked, surrounded by Canada and the United States, dependent on trade routes, dependent on export access. That reality makes pure independence complex. And somewhere in that conversation, sometimes jokingly, sometimes seriously, a new idea enters. If we align more with U.S. states like Montana or Texas, why not just join them? At first, it sounds outrageous. But the more polarized politics becomes, the more outrageous ideas get oxygen, especially when cultural alignment narratives grow stronger. Some Albertans feel culturally closer to conservative American states than to Eastern Canadian provinces. They see similarities in energy policy priorities, in rural identity, in skepticism toward federal oversight. Again, this is not a majority position. But movements do not need to be majority movements to shape discourse. They need visibility. And in the age of social media, visibility is easy. Now imagine this conversation spreading during a severe economic downturn. Oil prices collapse. Unemployment rises. Federal policies tighten. Political rhetoric intensifies. In that environment, hypothetical ideas begin to feel less hypothetical. A referendum gets proposed, even symbolically. Campaigns form. Yard signs appear. And suddenly, what was once fringe becomes newsworthy. But here's the turning point. Even if Alberta voted to separate, even if it survived negotiations with Canada, even if it became an independent country, it would still face the largest question of all. Would the United States actually want it? And that is where this scenario becomes more than regional frustration. It becomes continental transformation. Because admitting a foreign former province as a U.S. state would be unprecedented in modern times. It would reshape political power in Washington. It would strain relations with Ottawa. It would force both nations into uncharted constitutional territory. And the deeper you examine it, the more you realize this is not just about oil or taxes. It's about sovereignty, about who decides, about how tightly a federation holds when regional identities pull outward. So let's step back. Right now, Alberta remains a province of Canada. There is no active, successful independence process underway. Support for full separation remains limited. The idea of becoming the 51st state remains highly improbable. But improbable does not mean meaningless. Because when people begin imagining alternative futures, they reveal dissatisfaction with the present. And dissatisfaction, if ignored, has a way of growing. So as we move into the next chapter, we're going to leave emotion behind and examine something colder. The law. Because even if Alberta's political will shifted dramatically tomorrow, the legal mountain it would have to climb is staggering. And what most people don't realize is that the first battle wouldn't even be with Washington. It would be with Ottawa. And that fight alone could redefine Canada forever. Imagine this. It's late at night in Edmonton. The votes are coming in. Tension fills the air. News anchors speak in careful, measured tones. A referendum has just been held. The question was clear, direct, unavoidable. Should Alberta begin the process of separating from Canada? The numbers start appearing on the screen. 49%, 50%, 51%. The room goes quiet. Because if that number holds, everything changes. But here's what most people misunderstand. A referendum victory does not mean independence. It means negotiation. And negotiation, in this case, would be one of the most complicated constitutional processes in modern democratic history. Let's slow this down and walk through it step by step. Because this is where fantasy meets reality. First, the vote itself. Under Canada's Clarity Act, the federal government in Ottawa has the authority to determine whether a referendum question is clear. It also determines whether the majority is clear. And that word, clear, is intentionally vague. Is 50.1% clear? Is 52% clear? Is 60% required? The law does not define the number, which means Ottawa would decide. Now imagine the tension. If Alberta votes 51% in favor of separation, but the federal government says that's not decisive enough, political outrage would erupt. Legal challenges would flood the courts. Protests could form. Confidence in federal institutions would strain. Even before negotiations begin, the country would be in crisis mode. But let's assume Ottawa recognizes the result. Now negotiations start. And this is where things become extremely complex. Separation is not just emotional. It is arithmetic. Canada's national debt is enormous. If Alberta leaves, it must assume a portion of that debt. But how much? Is it based on population, GDP contribution, historical tax payments? Each formula produces a different number. And we're not talking about small adjustments. We're talking about potentially tens or hundreds of billions of dollars. That debt would follow Alberta into independence. Investors would watch closely. Credit rating agencies would evaluate whether the new nation is stable or risky. Interest rates would rise or fall accordingly. And in that moment, uncertainty alone could cause economic tremors. Next comes assets, military bases, federal buildings, transportation infrastructure, energy regulators, pension systems. Who owns what? If a federal building sits in Calgary, does it automatically transfer to Alberta? Or does Canada retain ownership? What about the armed forces stationed within provincial borders? Does Alberta create its own military or negotiate defense agreements? And here is a detail that often gets overlooked. Canada's pension system. Millions of Albertans contribute to the Canada Pension Plan. If Alberta separates, does it create its own pension system? Does it withdraw its share of contributions? How is that calculated? How long would that transition take? Retirees would demand answers immediately, because pensions are not abstract policy debates. They are monthly survival. Then there is currency. Would an independent Alberta keep using the Canadian dollar? Would it create a new Alberta dollar? Would it attempt to adopt the US dollar informally? Each option carries consequences. A new currency requires a central bank. A central bank requires monetary policy. Monetary policy requires credibility. And credibility takes years to build. Markets do not automatically trust new financial systems. That trust must be earned. During that period, businesses might delay investment. Capital might leave. Uncertainty could ripple through the economy. And remember, Alberta's economy is heavily tied to energy exports. Energy markets are global. Investors hate instability. Now let's talk about borders. Right now, Alberta's borders are internal provincial lines. They are not international checkpoints. If Alberta becomes independent, those borders become real. Customs, immigration control, trade enforcement. Goods moving between Alberta and British Columbia would cross an international boundary. Truck drivers would need documentation. Supply chains would slow. Tariffs might be imposed, depending on trade agreements. And speaking of trade agreements, Alberta would no longer automatically be part of Canada's international trade deals. It would have to negotiate its own. That includes agreements with the United States, the European Union, Asia-Pacific nations. Trade negotiations take years, sometimes decades. During that gap, uncertainty would linger. But perhaps the most sensitive issue of all involves Indigenous treaties. Alberta is home to numerous First Nations whose treaty agreements were signed with the Canadian Crown. Those treaties are constitutionally protected. If Alberta leaves Canada, what happens to those agreements? They cannot simply be erased. Indigenous communities would have legal standing and moral authority in any negotiation. Some might oppose separation entirely. Others might demand new frameworks. The legal complexity here alone could take years to resolve, and it would rightfully require consent and consultation. This is not a detail that can be bypassed. It is central. Now imagine all of this happening at once. Debt division debates, asset negotiations, currency planning, trade uncertainty, border restructuring, Indigenous treaty consultations, pension system redesign. This is not a 6-month process. This could take a decade. During that decade, Alberta would exist in limbo. Not fully Canada, not yet fully independent, and certainly not yet American. Because remember, joining the United States can only happen after full independence. And independence itself is a mountain. There's another reality here. The Canadian federal government would not approach this casually. Losing Alberta would be economically and politically devastating. It would shrink Canada's GDP significantly. It would alter national identity. It would send signals to other provinces. If Alberta leaves, could others follow? Would British Columbia consider autonomy? Would Quebec revisit its own question? The stakes for Ottawa would be enormous, which means negotiations would be tough, calculated, possibly confrontational, but conducted under intense global scrutiny. Now pause for a moment. Close your eyes and picture this. A new flag being designed. A new constitution being drafted. International leaders deciding whether to recognize Alberta as a sovereign nation. Embassies opening. Diplomats negotiating. It feels cinematic. But every step would be contested, challenged in court, debated in parliament, argued on television. And during all of it, ordinary citizens would ask simple questions. What happens to my job? What happens to my healthcare? What happens to my savings? Because while politicians debate sovereignty, families worry about stability. And here's the truth most people don't consider. Even if Alberta voted to separate, even if negotiations concluded, even if independence was achieved, there is no guarantee the United States would agree to statehood. That would be an entirely separate political battle, one that would ignite Washington. And when we move into that phase of the story, the complexity doubles. Because now you're not just reshaping one country, you're reshaping two. So at this point, we have climbed only halfway up the mountain. The referendum passes. Negotiations begin. Independence is declared. Years pass. Markets fluctuate. Borders solidify. The world adjusts. Only then does Alberta approach the United States and say, "We would like to join." And that is where this scenario becomes even more explosive. Because the U.S. Constitution has something to say about admitting new states. And American politics would not treat this as a minor administrative decision. It would be one of the most controversial debates in modern U.S. history. Next chapter. Would Washington say yes? And why admitting Alberta could trigger a political earthquake in the United States. Picture this. It's years after Alberta voted to separate. The negotiations with Canada were painful. Markets were volatile. Borders were redrawn. A new national government was formed. Alberta is now independent. And now, for the first time, its leaders formally approach Washington. They submit a request. Not for a trade deal. Not for a defense pact. For statehood. 50 stars already sit on the American flag. To add another would not just be symbolic. It would be transformative. Because admitting a new state is not a casual process. It reshapes power. And in American politics, power is everything. Let's slow down and examine the mechanics. The U.S. Constitution gives Congress the authority to admit new states. Historically, this happened when territories within U.S. borders developed enough population and governance to qualify. Alberta would be different. It would be a former foreign entity seeking admission. That makes it rare in modern history. Congress would have two primary theoretical paths. Pass a joint resolution through both the House of Representatives and the Senate. Or approve a treaty, which would require a two-thirds vote in the Senate. Either route demands significant political consensus. And consensus in Washington is never easy. Now imagine the debate begins. The first question is immediate and blunt. How would Alberta vote? Because statehood means representation. 2 U.S. senators. A number of House seats based on population. Electoral votes in presidential elections. Alberta has roughly 4 to 5 million people. That would likely translate into several House seats and a meaningful number of electoral votes. Suddenly, campaign strategists are recalculating maps. Would Alberta lean Republican? Would it surprise analysts? Would urban Calgary and Edmonton trend differently than rural regions? No one would know with certainty. And uncertainty makes politicians nervous. If one party believes Alberta would strengthen the opposing party, they might resist statehood purely for electoral reasons. This is not hypothetical. Throughout American history, new states have often been admitted in political pairs to balance Senate power. Power calculations would dominate headlines. Cable news panels would argue daily. Presidential candidates would campaign on it. The debate would not be quiet. It would be thunderous. Then comes the economic question. Alberta is energy-rich. Oil sands, natural gas, agriculture. Some U.S. lawmakers would see opportunity. Direct access to major energy reserves within U.S. borders. Stronger continental energy security. Expanded trade without international complications. But others would ask difficult questions. What about environmental regulations? Would Alberta's energy practices align with U.S. federal standards? Would new infrastructure investments be required? How would federal funding formulas adjust? Because statehood also means federal spending obligations. Highways, healthcare programs, education funding, disaster relief. Alberta would pay federal taxes, but it would also receive federal support. Budget analysts would run projections nonstop. Supporters would argue economic expansion. Opponents would warn about fiscal strain. And then comes the diplomatic dimension. Canada is one of America's closest allies. The two nations share the longest undefended border in the world. They cooperate militarily through NORAD. They are deeply intertwined economically. Admitting Alberta would not be a quiet internal adjustment. It would be interpreted globally as a geopolitical shock. Even if Alberta became independent first, the optics would be explosive. Critics might frame it as American expansionism. Supporters would call it voluntary democratic alignment. The narrative would matter. An international reaction would follow quickly. Allies would ask questions. Markets would respond. Trade partners would assess risk. This would not be a local story. It would be global. Inside Congress, hearings would begin. Legal scholars would testify. Constitutional experts would debate. Is this permissible under existing frameworks? Does admitting a former province of a close ally create new precedent? Would it encourage other regional movements globally? Lawmakers would weigh not just Alberta, but the signal it sends. Because once you redraw borders in North America, you remind the world that borders are not eternal. And that realization carries consequences. Now imagine the public reaction. In some U.S. states, there would be enthusiasm, shared energy interests, cultural similarities in rural regions. In others, there would be skepticism, concerns about federal balance, questions about identity. Would Alberta retain certain cultural distinctions? Would it integrate seamlessly? Or would differences become points of tension? The American public is diverse. Opinions would vary sharply. Town halls would fill. Opinion polls would fluctuate weekly. And during this entire debate, Alberta would wait, its future hanging in the balance of another nation's legislature. Here's something even more complex. What if Congress says no? Independence would already have been achieved. Alberta would stand alone, rejected by the United States. That possibility alone would weigh heavily during negotiations. Because once you leave a federation, returning is not simple. The decision to pursue U.S. statehood would be high risk. There would be no guaranteed landing. But let's imagine Congress says yes. The resolution passes. The president signs it. The American flag prepares for a 51st star. In that moment, celebration would erupt in some communities. Concern would ripple through others. And the world would adjust to a new map. 2 new senators are sworn in. Electoral math shifts. Federal agencies expand jurisdiction northward. U.S. law becomes supreme law within Alberta's borders. The U.S. dollar becomes official currency. The transformation would be immediate and profound, but it would not be frictionless. Because political integration is not just paperwork. It is culture. It is identity. It is expectation. And the next chapter of this story would not be about Congress. It would be about consequences. Because reshaping borders reshapes relationships. And Canada, now without Alberta, would not simply move on quietly. Next chapter. Canada's response. The constitutional shockwave and the tension that could redefine North America. The morning after. The ink is dry. Alberta is no longer part of Canada. Or perhaps even more dramatically, Alberta has just been approved to join the United States. Either way, the map has changed. For Canadians, this would not feel abstract. It would feel personal. Because Alberta is not just land on a map. It is a pillar of the national economy. A major energy producer. A contributor to federal revenues. A defining part of modern Canadian identity. And now it's gone. The first response would not be military. It would be political. Emergency sessions in Parliament. Statements from the Prime Minister. Reassurances about stability. Calm words delivered carefully. But beneath the calm tone, the pressure would be enormous. Because losing Alberta would trigger a constitutional shockwave. Canada's federation is built on provinces voluntarily united under one constitution. If one province successfully leaves, it proves that exit is possible. And once something becomes possible, it becomes precedent. Other provinces would begin asking questions. British Columbia might examine autonomy discussions. Quebec would inevitably revisit its own historic debates. Atlantic provinces might reassess economic relationships. Even if none pursued separation, the psychological shift would be real. The idea that the federation is permanent would be replaced by the knowledge that it is conditional. That alone reshapes politics. Economically, the impact would be immediate. Alberta contributes significantly to Canada's GDP. It plays a central role in the country's energy exports. Its departure would shrink the national economy overnight. The Canadian dollar could face volatility. Investors would reassess long-term growth projections. Credit rating agencies would evaluate the stability of what remains. Equalization formulas would need recalculation. Federal budgets would require restructuring. This is not simply subtraction. Federal budgets would require restructuring. This is not simply subtraction. It is recalibration of an entire national financial system. And then there is energy. Without Alberta, Canada's energy production profile changes dramatically. Other provinces produce energy, yes, but Alberta is dominant in oil sands and large-scale extraction. The remaining Canada would need to rethink its economic strategy. Would it double down on diversification? Would it accelerate green energy transitions? Would it pursue new trade relationships to compensate? Every option carries cost and complexity, and political debates would intensify because economic strategy is not neutral. It reflects ideology, and ideology would be under strain. But perhaps the most sensitive issue would be national identity. Canada defines itself in part through geography, through shared history, through vast landscapes stretching from coast to coast. Remove Alberta, and the physical shape of the country changes. So does its symbolic narrative. School textbooks would need revision. Maps would be redrawn. Generations raised believing in a stable federation would now confront a new reality. That kind of psychological shift is hard to measure, but impossible to ignore. Now let's consider the diplomatic layer. Canada and the United States are not distant rivals. They are deeply integrated allies. They share defense agreements. They share trade frameworks. They share intelligence partnerships. If Alberta becomes the 51st state, Canada would face a complicated choice. Maintain close cooperation as before, or treat the move as a historic grievance. Even if the process were peaceful and democratic, tensions would rise. Because from Canada's perspective, losing a province to its closest ally would be emotionally and politically destabilizing. Negotiations over water rights, border infrastructure, and energy pipelines would intensify. Every cross-border agreement would need revision. What was once domestic becomes international, and international negotiations are slower, colder, and more strategic. Now imagine Canadian public opinion. Some would blame Alberta for destabilizing the country. Others would blame federal policy for driving it away. Political parties would campaign on restoring unity. New movements could form demanding constitutional reform. There might be calls to rewrite aspects of the federation to prevent future departures. In extreme cases, political polarization could deepen significantly, because when nations experience territorial loss, even peaceful loss, it leaves scars. And then there is the most delicate question of all. Would Canada ever consider reversing course? If years passed and Alberta faced challenges within the United States, could it seek renewed partnership? Would Canada accept it back? Would that even be legally possible? The separation process would likely include clauses preventing easy reversal, which means the decision would be historic and permanent. That permanence raises the emotional stakes dramatically. Meanwhile, global powers would observe closely. Europe would analyze implications for regional separatist movements. Asia would evaluate trade stability. Other federations, Germany, Australia, India, would quietly assess their own internal cohesion. Because when one stable democracy redraws internal borders peacefully, it signals possibility elsewhere. North America would become a case study, and global politics pays attention to case studies. Now let's zoom out. Imagine the North American continent after this transformation. The United States extends further north. Canada is smaller but still strong. New trade corridors are established. Defense agreements are renegotiated. Energy markets adjust. Citizens adapt. Life continues, but differently. Because borders shape psychology. They shape how people think about belonging. And when those borders move, identity must adjust. But here's the deeper question. Would this event stabilize the region long-term? Or would it create ripple effects that continue for decades? Because political change rarely stops at its first consequence. It evolves. If Alberta leaves and thrives economically within the United States, others might reconsider their own positions. If Alberta struggles, it becomes a cautionary tale. Either outcome would influence future debates. And the future of federations depends heavily on perception. Now pause. Take a breath. We began this story as a theoretical scenario, an unlikely idea. But as we've moved chapter by chapter, you can see something clearly. Even the process of imagining it reveals just how interconnected modern nations are. Separation is not just political. It is economic, legal, cultural, psychological, geopolitical. Every thread pulls on another. And we still haven't examined what everyday life would actually look like for people living there. Because beyond constitutions and congresses, there are families, workers, students, retirees, people whose lives would change overnight. And in the next chapter, we step into that world. Next chapter, what daily life would look like inside the 51st state. Taxes, healthcare, identity, and the human cost of redrawing borders. Forget Congress. Forget Parliament. Forget diplomatic press conferences. Imagine instead a family in Calgary waking up the morning after Alberta officially becomes the 51st U.S. state. The news is still running wall-to-wall coverage. Maps on every screen. Commentators analyzing what happens next. But inside that house, the questions are much simpler. What changes for us? Do we still have healthcare coverage? What happens to our taxes? Is our mortgage affected? Are we American now? Because when borders shift, history books update. But daily life is what people feel first. Let's begin with citizenship. If Alberta becomes a U.S. state, residents would need a clear legal transition. Would citizenship automatically convert? Would residents need to apply? Would dual citizenship be allowed? Legal frameworks would determine this, but the emotional shift would be immediate. For generations, people identified as Canadian. They carried Canadian passports. They celebrated Canadian national holidays. Now they would be Americans. That change is not just administrative. It touches identity. School children would pledge allegiance to a different flag. Sports allegiances would shift. International travel documents would change. Some would embrace it. Others would feel a quiet sense of loss. Identity is layered, and when it changes suddenly, adjustment takes time. Now let's talk about taxes. Canada and the United States have different tax systems. Federal income tax brackets differ. Sales tax structures differ. Corporate tax frameworks differ. If Alberta becomes a state, U.S. federal tax law applies. Residents would file U.S. federal tax returns. They would pay into U.S. Social Security instead of Canadian pension systems. That transition alone would require massive administrative restructuring. Accountants would be overwhelmed. Businesses would need new compliance departments. Financial software systems would need updates. For high earners, taxes might go up. For others, they might go down. The outcome would vary depending on income level and deductions. And uncertainty during transition could cause confusion and anxiety. Now we reach one of the most sensitive areas. Healthcare. Canada operates a publicly funded healthcare system. The United States operates a mixed system combining private insurance, employer-based coverage, and public programs. If Alberta becomes a U.S. state, it would shift into the American healthcare framework. Residents might receive employer-sponsored insurance. Those without employer coverage might rely on federal programs or private plans. Premiums, deductibles, and copays would become part of everyday vocabulary. For some, access might feel faster. For others, cost concerns could increase. The psychological adjustment alone would be significant. Healthcare touches every family, and any shift in how it works creates immediate emotional reaction. Now consider employment. Alberta's energy sector would gain direct integration into U.S. domestic energy markets. Companies headquartered in Houston or Dallas might expand operations northward without international regulatory barriers. Job mobility between former border regions would increase. Workers could relocate within the United States without immigration paperwork. But there would also be competition. American labor markets are larger and more diverse. Some industries might flourish. Others might face new pressures. Federal labor laws would apply. Minimum wage standards. Union regulations. Workplace safety oversight. Each change would ripple through companies large and small. Education would shift too. Federal education funding formulas would now apply. Student loan systems would change. Curriculum standards might evolve over time. University accreditation would integrate into U.S. systems. Students might gain easier access to American institutions. But tuition structures could also shift. Scholarship programs would change. And for families planning long-term educational paths, uncertainty during transition could create stress. Then there is law enforcement and the legal system. U.S. federal law would apply in full. Federal courts would extend jurisdiction. Constitutional rights under the U.S. Bill of Rights would govern legal disputes. Gun laws, in particular, would likely change significantly. Canada's firearms regulations are generally stricter than many U.S. states. As a new state, Alberta would fall under federal U.S. law and whatever state-level legislation its new legislature passes. This could become one of the most debated issues during integration. Cultural differences in this area alone could shape state politics for decades. Now imagine the border itself. The former Alberta-Montana line would no longer be international. Travel between Calgary and Billings would feel like driving between two states. But the new international border between Alberta and the rest of Canada would require customs enforcement. Families with relatives in British Columbia or Saskatchewan would cross an international boundary to visit. Trade routes that once flowed freely inside Canada would now involve documentation and inspection. Supply chains would adjust. Local businesses near the new border might experience disruption. It would feel strange, because what was once internal becomes external. And that shift is psychological as much as procedural. Let's zoom into something quieter. National holidays. Canada Day would no longer be a federal holiday. Instead, Independence Day becomes the central summer celebration. Veterans Day replaces Remembrance Day observances under U.S. federal standards. Symbols change. Ceremonies change. Flags outside schools change. For some, this would feel exciting. For others, bittersweet. Cultural memory does not vanish overnight. It lingers, and it shapes how people interpret change. Politically, Alberta would now participate in U.S. presidential elections. Campaign rallies would fill arenas. National political parties would establish permanent operations. 2 U.S. senators would represent the state in Washington. House members would campaign across districts that once voted in Canadian federal elections. The political language itself would evolve. Debates would reference different constitutional frameworks, different historical narratives, different policy traditions. That transition could take a generation to fully normalize. But here's something deeper. Communities would divide. Some residents would celebrate economic integration and expanded opportunity. Others might feel displaced or disconnected. Political polarization could intensify during early years, because identity shifts rarely occur without emotional friction. And when friction meets economic adjustment, tensions can rise. The stability of the transition would depend heavily on leadership, both state and federal, to reassure, stabilize, and unify. Now step back and picture 10 years later. Children who were toddlers during the transition now grow up fully American. They learn U.S. history in school. They see Alberta as just another state. For them, the shift is normal. For their parents, it remains historic. Over time, memory softens. Systems stabilize. Life becomes routine again. But the story of how it happened would remain a defining chapter in North American history. And yet, there is one final dimension we haven't explored. What if the economic promises fail? What if integration creates unforeseen challenges? What if political polarization intensifies instead of settling? Because every historic transformation carries risk. And in the final chapter, we confront the ultimate question. Would becoming the 51st state actually solve the frustrations that sparked the idea in the first place? Or would it simply replace one set of tensions with another? That's where we're heading next. Let's go back to the beginning. Why did this idea even surface? Economic frustration, energy policy disputes, perceived political imbalance, cultural distance from Ottawa. At its core, the 51st state conversation is not really about borders. It's about control. Control over resources. Control over taxation. Control over regulation. Control over political destiny. So now imagine Alberta has successfully joined the United States. Years have passed. The excitement has faded. The headlines are gone. What remains? Reality. Supporters of statehood would expect certain outcomes. Greater access to U.S. markets. Fewer federal barriers to energy development. Lower taxes in certain brackets. Stronger alignment with conservative policy priorities. But here's the uncomfortable truth about federal systems. They are all compromises. The United States is not a blank slate. It is its own vast federation with its own internal divisions. Energy policy in the U.S. is debated fiercely. Environmental regulations vary by administration. Federal courts intervene. Congress changes hands. Presidents shift direction. If Alberta sought relief from one federal system, it would enter another. Different structure, different constitution, same fundamental reality. Power is shared. Compromise is constant. No state has total control. Let's examine energy specifically. Would Alberta's oil sector gain advantages as part of the United States? Possibly. Integration into domestic U.S. energy markets could simplify certain export logistics. Pipeline infrastructure might expand more easily across state lines. But U.S. environmental policy shifts with elections. One administration might accelerate drilling. Another might restrict it. Federal agencies still regulate. Courts still review. Activist movements still organize. The idea that joining the U.S. would eliminate regulatory debate entirely is unrealistic. It would simply relocate the debate. Now consider taxes again. Some residents might see lower income tax burdens depending on federal and state rates. Others might see increases when accounting for healthcare premiums, insurance structures, or local taxation adjustments. And here's something rarely acknowledged. The U.S. federal deficit is large. Spending debates are constant. National debt levels are high. Becoming part of that system means sharing its fiscal trajectory. Economic opportunity exists, yes, but fiscal challenges exist too. No nation escapes trade-offs. Let's talk about cultural identity over time. Initially, there might be friction, generational divides, older residents holding on to Canadian traditions, younger generations adapting quickly. Over decades, integration would likely normalize. But would political polarization increase? Possibly. The United States currently experiences intense partisan division. By joining, Alberta would not be entering a calm environment. It would be entering a high-energy political ecosystem. Campaign cycles are relentless. National media influence is constant. Federal policy swings can be dramatic. Some Albertans might thrive in that atmosphere. Others might find it exhausting. Now let's flip the lens. What if Alberta remained in Canada and pursued reform internally instead? Because separation is one path. Reform is another. Political systems evolve. Policies shift. Leadership changes. Public opinion moves. Sometimes the threat of separation strengthens negotiation leverage within a federation. Sometimes it fades as economic conditions improve. History shows that regional discontent often rises during economic downturns and softens during prosperity. Which raises a crucial question. Is the frustration structural or cyclical? If oil prices rebound strongly and federal policy moderates, would the 51st state conversation lose momentum? If economic diversification expands successfully within Canada, would the urgency diminish? Movements often feel permanent in the moment, but many fade when conditions shift. There's also a geopolitical risk few talk about openly. If Alberta joined the U.S., it could encourage other separatist movements globally. Peaceful, democratic shifts are preferable to conflict, of course. But global stability relies partly on predictable borders. When one stable democracy redraws its internal lines, it sets precedent. Precedent can inspire both orderly and disorderly movements elsewhere. North America's stability has long been one of its greatest strengths. Major border changes would test that perception. Now step back even further. Strip away the politics. Strip away the maps. What remains? People. Families building lives. Workers paying mortgages. Students planning futures. Retirees counting on pensions. Most people do not wake up thinking about constitutional realignment. They think about stability, opportunity, security. The 51st state scenario is dramatic. It is bold. It is historic. But dramatic solutions do not always produce dramatic improvements. Sometimes they introduce new complexities. So here we are. After referendums, after negotiations, after congressional debates, after integration, we return to the core question. What problem was this meant to solve? If the problem is economic volatility tied to global energy markets, that volatility does not disappear under a different flag. If the problem is political frustration with distant federal decision-makers, Washington is no closer geographically than Ottawa. If the problem is cultural identity, identity does not automatically align simply because borders shift. Big moves carry big consequences, sometimes necessary, sometimes transformative, sometimes destabilizing. Now imagine 20 years in the future. Children born after the transition know nothing else. They grow up American. Or perhaps Alberta never leaves, and they grow up Canadian in a reformed federation. Either way, time smooths the edges of controversy. But the lesson remains. Federations survive not because exit is impossible, They survive because most people believe staying together is better than leaving. When that belief weakens, conversations like this begin. And whether Alberta ever seriously pursues this path or not, the fact that it is discussed tells us something deeper about modern politics. Trust matters. Economic fairness matters. Regional identity matters. And when those feel strained, even improbable ideas gain attention. So here's the final thought. Alberta becoming the 51st state is highly unlikely. The legal barriers are enormous. The political costs are staggering. The diplomatic risks are historic. But the conversation itself is a signal. A signal about dissatisfaction. A signal about identity. A signal about how federations must continuously adapt or risk fracture. And now the question shifts to you. What holds a country together more strongly? Geography, law, or belief? Because in the end, borders endure only as long as the people inside them choose to keep them. Don't forget to subscribe on your way out. See you next video.